Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Larry Stutzriem, retired Major General, Air Force, and I'm Director of Research at Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. And today we're going to talk about the munitions of tomorrow. We'll be discussing the need for a cost-effective mix of precision-guided munitions to meet the wartime demands of near-peer conflict. I have to echo the words of Air Combat Command Commander Mark Grace Kelly. He said something from last September that we're not going to be a fifth-generation Air Force until its fifth-generation fighters have fifth-generation weapons and fifth-generation sensing. Well, the same holds true for our bombers. And while we've made a lot of headway in aircraft types like the F-35 and the B-21, we need to arm them for success. On top of this, we lack a deep bench of stores for them to be successful when it comes to key weapons. We've also sized the munitions industrial complex to lack ability to surge production in time of need, especially in some of the more exquisite systems that we'll need in large numbers when the shooting starts. This all adds up to the conclusion that it's time to have a concerted focus on munitions. So we will. So let me introduce our panel. First, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, also from the Air Force, retired. He's our Dean at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. I've worked for him for the last 20 years on and off, and those of us who have worked for him refer to him as the avenging angel of air power, and he is. And we also have with us from Mitchell Institute, my friend here, Mark Gonzo Gunzinger. He's the bombastic big bopper of the bomber, flying the B-52, but later in his career, both in the military and as a civil servant, became deeply involved in policy and planning. He was a deputy assistant, he was a DASI for force planning. And then we have, to my far left here, we have Dr. John Corley. He's lead for Ordnance Sciences at AFRL Munitions Directorate. And you might refer to him as the Mr. Peabody and Sherman of things that go boom. Is that right? Yeah, okay. And a piece of history that's interesting about him is back in Desert Storm, he's the man that brought GBU-28 across the finish line. One of many. And that was for you youngsters, that was the bunker buster that brought Saddam Hussein to his knees. So we've got a distinguished panel. And of course, Gunzinger has done recently a report about the need to have the right cost-effective mix of precision-guided munitions to meet the future demands of conflict. And Gonzo, I'm going to ask you to give a short summary of your findings of that report, and then I'd like to offer General Deptula and Dr. Corley make some opening comments. Gonzo?
Hey, thanks for coming. Really appreciate you showing up on this critically important topic. I've been engaged in future munitions requirements for, probably 20 years in the Air Force, and then in the Office of Secretary of Defense, where I had oversight of that portfolio for Secretary Gates. So when talking about future requirements, it's always important to ground them in our strategy, our national defense strategy. Now, our strategy requires the services, first slide, to size their forces to defeat a peer adversary's invasion of an area that they seek to dominate, much as we're seeing right now in Ukraine. Now, that's going to require our forces to go on the offensive within hours, not wait weeks to build up a force structure in theater before kicking off a campaign. Of course, by then, China or Russia will have achieved their objectives. And that means that aerospace power will be the predominant means to rapidly respond from inside and outside a theater to strike those thousands of targets in hundreds of hours that are needed to blunt an invasion. Next slide. That said, it's well known that our PGM inventory has been sized in the past for lesser regional conflicts, and DoD has chronically underfunded its weapons programs. And an undersized PGM inventory means our air forces may not have the weapons they need for a high-intensity conflict, especially one that is not short and sharp. Now, this example shows our Air Force could quickly expand its in-theater JASMs and LRASMs in an operation to blunt an invasion of Taiwan. But the real question is, if you look at the chart, what kind of weapons would they have to use after day 12 or 13 of that kind of campaign? Because using non-stealth, non-survivable weapons would decrease the effectiveness of our strikes, and going back to relying on direct attack weapons like we've used in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan the past 20 years would increase risk to our air forces operating in highly contested environments. Next slide. So in addition to capacity, DoD's current PGM mix is unbalanced, which is why we're hearing so much about the need for a different mix of weapons in the future. The preponderance of the Air Force's PGMs are direct attack weapons, which are best suited for strikes in permissive environments, like I said, plus a much smaller number of those longer range standoff weapons. Now, that made sense in the past, where our aircraft were not threatened by advanced IADs, but strikes with short-range direct attack weapons will not be the norm in a fight with China. And as the slide says, very long-range weapons tend to be larger, which reduces the number that can be carried per sortie, and more costly, which reduces the number that our military can afford to buy. So an unbalanced PGM mix can reduce the number of targets that we can attack with acceptable risk, and that's why we need a family of next-generation mid-range weapons, as you see on the chart. Weapons that are sized to fit internally in our 5th and 6th generation aircraft to maximize their lethality and bring to the fight what no other service can, and that's the penetrating strike capacity that'll be decisive. Next slide. So, our force planners must also consider the characteristics of the future target sets as they develop weapons requirements. Now, to cite Secretary Kendall, our target set in a war with China would be very different than the target set that China is preparing to attack, which is why simply replicating the kinds of weapons that China is investing in doesn't make sense for us. So I actually adapted this chart for one used 12 years ago to illustrate the need for a new penetrating bomber. And it shows some of the advantages and disadvantages of penetrating and standoff weapons, many of which are related to their attributes, such as their warhead sizes, their flight times, and so forth. China, as is Russia, as is North Korea and Iran, using mobility, hardening, deeply buried facilities, camouflage, and other means to degrade our strike effectiveness. Our best long-range standoff weapons simply can't carry warheads that are large enough to penetrate very hard, deeply buried targets, and their longer flight times can reduce their effectiveness on mobile targets, which is what you see on the slide. The point is, it's those kinds of assessments that are needed to define the right mix of weapons in our future inventory. Next slide. So I'll also touch on survivability, which, John, I think you're going to get into. But by that, I mean the ability of individual weapons to survive to reach their aim points. Now, this chart's based on simple math. It shows that as enemy defenses become more capable of tracking and interdicting our weapons, individual PGMs, the number of weapons and sorties needed to strike a given target set increases. It's logical. The point is, simply throwing more sorties and legacy weapons at this problem isn't feasible. Our Air Force, the CAF, is about half the size of the force that was on the ramp during Desert Storm. We simply can't generate those kind of sorties needed to overcome these weapons losses. A better choice is to acquire a new generation of PGMs that are low observable, can maneuver, fly at higher speeds, and so forth, otherwise designed to survive. Next slide. So to wrap up, it's also important to seek the right balance between the range, the size, the survivability, and the cost of our future PGMs. Now, as Secretary Kendall has said, cost effectiveness is a major consideration for our weapons investments, especially for weapons that are going to be used in peer fights where we may have to expend tens and tens of thousands of them. So as this chart shows, weapon unit costs tend to increase with their range and their sophistication, and that's why in our report we recommended investing in a family of those mid-range weapons, range between 50 to 250 nautical miles after release. They have a unit cost somewhere in a range of $300K or maybe even less. And that's what the little table on the chart shows. How many of those weapons can we buy for $5 billion, which is really pretty reasonable for a munitions program? And how many days of combat could they support if launched at a reasonable rate of 500 per day? And finally, next slide. While DoD should certainly field some hypersonic weapons, their high cost could constrain how many it can afford to buy, especially if you're looking at very expensive boost glide weapons on the order of the long-range hypersonic weapon the Army is investing in, which could cost somewhere between $40 and $50 million per shot, or per target, if you will. Well, that's back to you for questions. Again, thanks for coming.
General Deptula, response.
Well, greetings, everyone. As you might expect, I fully support the work of Colonel Gunzinger, more affectionately known as Gonzo. His paper, for those of you who haven't read it, I'd certainly commend it to you, as it provides a foundation for what I think the Air Force ought to be planning. After decades of deferred and canceled modernization programs, the Air Force's lead over peer competitors is eroding, and we're just simply undersized for the operational demands that we're asked to meet. Unfortunately, during peacetime, one of the places that programmers go to find funds for other priorities are the munitions accounts. Now, that's because there are very few advocates for increasing munition inventories during peacetime. Therefore, when conflict does break out, we find ourselves facing munition shortages just when we need them in great or at least sufficient quantities. You know, as you get older, you tend to tell more war stories, but I vividly recall during the opening months of Operation Enduring Freedom, when I was a Combined Air Operations Center commander, basically got a message saying, hey, stop using so many PGMs every day. You know, our stocks are getting low. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, we've only been doing this for 3 weeks. And we're only hitting 70 to 80 DIMPs a day, desired mean points of impact. I mean, you gotta be kidding me. We're starting to run low? This is Afghanistan. You know, these are 16th century tribesmen that we're going against, not the Russians or the Chinese. The bottom line is, imagine a modern major regional conflict with on the order of 100,000 aim points in a matter of a few months. But as Gonzo alluded to, in this day and age, it's not just about quantity. We're faced with issues of manpower to build up weapons, survivability characteristics, range, adaptability to various targets, and many, many issues, as those of you who are experts in munitions in here are aware of. So what the Air Force needs to do is it's got to move out smartly to develop a new generation of mid-range stand-in PGMs that cost less than long-range standoff weapons to help develop a sufficient PGM inventory. Look, we're not going to do 100,000 plus aim points with standoff. There's not enough money in the Department of Defense to be able to do that. But we do need to be able to prepare to take care of that number of targets. So next generation stand-in PGMs designed with low observability and other features to penetrate advanced integrated air defense systems are kind of key to our ability to maintain that kind of deterrent effect that hopefully we'll get back to being able to accomplish so we can prevent the kinds of things that we're seeing in Europe today happening in other places around the world. combining the range, survivability, and ability of penetrating aircraft to complete kill chains independently with next-generation stand-in PGMs will significantly increase the Air Force's lethality, and it's something we got to move off of PowerPoint into production. So with that, back to you, Stutz.
Thanks, boss. Dr. Corley, comments?
Well, again, thanks for the opportunity to be here and to speak to AFA and to represent AFRL Munitions Director at Agile Air Force Base and Colonel Meeks as the director there. I'd say yes and. So I think obviously we need something between hypersonic weapons and stand-in direct attack munitions and something that's affordable. And I would say a subset of affordable mass would be affordable standoff. So I think we don't have to necessarily go hypersonic to get in quick. We can have a high-speed cruise missile that's much more affordable using much more mature technology in the near term, something like a high Mach turbine engine that could not only get us to the target, at supersonic speeds, but also generate powder on the way to the target so that you could even increase its range. So I think it's not unimaginable that you could have a excess of 1,000 miles range, if you adjusted the warhead and you're trading fuel for for warhead space. Matter of fact, we're working on a concept at AFRL called the it's called the Air Launch Responsive Strike Missile, and it does just that. And it's a feeder to a study that's going on for the Advanced Long Range Affordable Munition that's in works and being studied right now. But you can't have a Gucci weapon just going after one target set. You've got to have a multi-mission warhead that, for any of these cruise missiles, that is pretty good at taking out not only your surface targets and your antennas and tails and those sorts of things, but also is okay at bunkers and buildings, and more recently, maritime targets. So we're developing technologies that can go after all of those. A second approach to achieving this affordable mass would be, I'll use the term organized chaos, and we've all talked about the ability to overwhelm and confuse the enemy by having network collaborative weapons, thousands of them in the air, at least hundreds of them in the air, integrated. This is long-term vision. I'm AFRL, I'm the long-term vision guy, right? So you can imagine having hundreds of these in the air networked together, making decisions on the fly, targeting each other, communicating back and forth with each other. But not only swarming, but having a loitering capability. So we don't want to just get to the target area and go right in. We want to have some gas left for loitering as well. And I'll use the term, and this was one that was coined at AFRL a few years back, heterogeneous integrated vehicle ensembles, hives. So it goes with the swarm theme. So you have hives that launch these swarms that are not only lethal packages, but they may have other payloads as well. You might have ISR payloads, you might have decoys on some of them, and some of them might have lethal and other type of payloads, including comm relay packages. You could even get, now bear with me, I know this is way out thinking, you could even have submunitions that were powered as well that you launch from these cruise missiles to extend the range of those even further. So that would be swarms of swarms to create confusion and give you some additional ability. You mentioned the idea of capacity, and we talk about the peace dividend, but I say there's a precision weapons dividend that we incurred after Desert Storm, where we've got precision weapons now. We don't need as many platforms. And guess what? We don't have as many platforms now, so we don't have as many hard points. We cannot, hang hundreds of these munitions just on conventional aircraft. So I think you're going to have to do something to take advantage of the broader launch platforms that we do have. Well, they may not even be launch platforms today. Think about transport aircraft. Think about palletized munitions. We've all seen the AFRL booth. Hopefully, if you haven't, go by and see what they're doing with Rapid Dragon, for instance. I want to give a shout out to the Blue Horizon team. Do any of you all here in the room today? Blue Horizon? Blue Horizon is a group that was started by General Killer Quast at the Air University. And they're kind of a think tank within the Air Force of mid-grade officers that are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. And they have some concepts beyond Rapid Dragon. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically palletizing JASM, a pretty expensive missile, but it was an F-117 replacement, so it was a good trade in terms of cost when at the time it was developed. but it's probably not exactly right missile for a palletized munition to be affordable. But think about concepts where you could have a less exquisite, more fragile missile that would be capable of being delivered in mass at a lower cost and quantity, and being able to produce, if you make them at at large quantities, you could realize the economies of scale. But back to Blue Horizon, they actually have some concepts, besides pushing these out of transport aircraft with manned platforms, they've been talking about droning planes out of the boneyard and using them to launch swarms of palletized munitions, and then you don't have a return flight. You just drone them into a target as well, so the vehicle itself becomes the target. When we look at, you think, well, how are we going to get to an affordable cruise missile that could be affordable enough to palletize? We've actually got a concept, and again, it's a blank sheet concept, where at AFRL called Cleaver, which is all about affordability, making things that are survivable to the extent that they need to be, but also more affordable. And they're WOSA compliant, so you could plug any payloads in there. You don't have to crack them open, it doesn't matter if you crack them open. You can crack them open and replace the payloads and change them out, but update the warheads after their 20-year period. And essentially you come up with, and they don't have to have, all of them have large 1,000-pound payloads in them. They could essentially be flying fuel tanks where you have reasonable size payload that you're trading, range, and then have something left in the gas tank when you get there. And then the final part that I'd like to talk is about agile combat employment. I think we talk about direct attack munitions, but if you think about containerized munitions, right now our direct attack munitions are shipped over in multiple containers into the field, and it is a logistical nightmare to ship all of those around in these big shipment containers, unpack them, reassemble them, and now you got to do that. If you want to Highland hop, you got to do that again every day. No, let's just have containers that we can pull them out, take unitary munitions that are already built up, and all up rounds, hang them on the aircraft, and so we're working concepts like that as well.
Hey, John, just real quick before we get to the questions. I didn't want to imply that standoff weapons are bad.
Right.
Right. No, we need both. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, but that hole is missing on those mid-range weapons. The other point is it's not about weapons cost. It really is cost per target, which is hard to show on the slide. Right. That's the metric.
We'll talk about that a little bit. Dr. Corley, it's great that you're thinking logistically, too, as you develop this. Very important. General Deptula, let me ask you, we have been talking about how important it is to get this right mix of PGMs for a long time. And everybody's been talking, but what's different today? Why is it so important to get this right now?
2 words: Russia, Ukraine. The threat of pure conflict today is real. Now, Desert Storm involved about 45,000 aim points. That was our last real major regional conflict. Afghanistan, Iraq, those were small-scale contingencies. If you go back to Desert Storm, only about 6% of all the weapons employed were precision-guided munitions. If you fast forward 25 years to Operation Inherent Resolve, those were operations against the Islamic State, over 95% of the munitions used were PGMs. But since the numbers of weapons applied were very small, on average between 10 and 15 strike sorties a day, with about 1 weapon drop per each, we could handle that. But imagine a repeat of a major regional contingency on the order of a Desert Storm, but with a China or Russia. That's what bumps up those aim points to on the order of 100,000 or more. So do we have that number of weapons on hand to deal with that magnitude of a threat? No, we don't have the capacity to generate that number of weapons in a matter of weeks. So we need to get to stockpiling modern munitions with the capabilities that we desire now. Now, you heard John already talk about some of the desired capabilities. Let me highlight what I believe we need to use as guidelines to shape this new stand-in weapons inventory. 5 items: broad sense, adaptability, lethality, simplified logistics, reliability, and then reduce total cost. I'm not going to go into each one of them because, we could dig down into a level of detail that we just need not to do here. But let me just give you an example what I mean by adaptability. Incorporating a universal arming interface platform language. Resilient GPS, INS, and terminal secret capabilities. So we're not tied to just one. Data linked, enhanced standoff. I mean, we're looking at something, minimum range of 50 miles. Multi-mission capability, blast frag, penetration, blast low, collateral damage. Open system architecture, all up round and compatible with almost any bomb dropping platform in the inventory. So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to be aiming toward.
A similar question, I'll go to Dr. Corley, and that is, in this regime Gonzo talks about in the direct attack, that shorter range piece, what attributes are you looking for in addition to this to get the right capability there, and what operational factors drive those attributes? Can you prioritize those a bit?
Okay. Well, I think, as we spoke, there's going to be, and as been said, there's been thousands of DIMPs and hundreds of hours that we're going to have to go after. And do we have the stockpiles today even to do that? And every drop is going to have to count, right? So I think reliability is job one. You have to make sure that every strike is going to survive the impact of the target, and the fuse is going to function. Right now, we know that we launch several weapons sometimes to take out a single target. We've got to up our reliability of our weapons, so to make sure that we can trust that one shot will do. And that goes in line with part of the reason we launch multiple weapons is because our lethality tools are somewhat lacking. So we don't have enough confidence in the process that we use to characterize our weapons through static arena test, and then say, let's do 3 arena tests and then we're good to go. And but we're not sure, so we're going to drop 2 weapons just in case. And we're just not going to have the luxury of doing that in future fights with a peer competitor. I already mentioned, the idea about it being unitary and containerized. That makes, the implication is that they would have transportability as another ability, be able to get them into the fight. Of course, smaller is always good for larger loadouts, and we're looking at, more lethal blast mechanisms. People always talk about having the need to have larger warheads for more lethality. And I always say, as long as you're in the right place at the right time, you can have a pretty small weapon and do the lethal effect. It's all a cost trade. And as I mentioned, we've got to have weapons that we can build in mass and leverage those economies of scale, because we're producing a single type of weapon, not multiple weapons for different target sets, but single weapons that can do a lot of different things. And obviously, they all have to be have open system architecture so they can be upgradable, and drive towards. Now, this is something that is, you have to think about this a minute, but a PK greater than 1. If your weapon can take out more than one target in process, then you've won the calculus there. So those are some of the attributes that I would talk to.
Very good. Let me. I'm going to kind of short us here. We don't have much time left. I'd like to ask General Deptula a cost per effect question, if we could, move on to that. And I'll come back to discussion of hypersonics with Dr. Corley and Gonzo, if that's okay. But General Deptula, these budgets have a huge impact on our munitions, both in terms of capacity and capability. And how does this concept that we've been talking about for a while now at Mitchell Institute, how does this concept of cost per effect enter the mix in that regard? How does it help us with that?
It's no secret that, as you described, that we need to refocus on the effectiveness piece of the cost-effective equation, because for too many years now we've only focused on cost, and so when we talk about cost per effect, you need to consider and compare the costs and effects that each weapon can create for the purpose of maximizing the value of desired operational outcomes. So it's sort of like you want to start at end game at the target and then work backwards from there. For airstrikes, these comparisons should include not just the number and cost of the PGMs, but the aircraft needed to execute the missions, as well as the direct support assets, such as refueling tankers, electromagnetic jamming platforms, SAM suppression efforts, and including air crews and infrastructure like basing and maintenance support. Now, let me use as an example what John's already mentioned, and that's the whole concept of agile combat engagement, because it's got to be a huge driving factor, and it's great in terms of an example. So in this particular case, think about it. We're looking at dispersed operations, so reducing manpower requirements becomes huge, as we won't, in the first place, we're not going to have the manpower to build up all these JDAMs as we've become used to in the past. Back to all-up rounds. We need all-up rounds that you can pull out of a container and jam to an aircraft with no additional hands-on time. So that's what cost per effect in the context of munitions is all about.
One point on cost per effect. This is something that we were both in, General Deptula. The analyses that took place to determine whether or not our nation needed a new penetrating bomber. And they took cost per effect into account. They did analyses, the various options, standoff versus penetrating payloads, and all that. And while the results were classified, we're getting a new penetrating bomber, and there's a very good reason for that.
Very good. Let me skip to hypersonics real quick. And this is for both Gonzo and Dr. Corley. I'll start with Gonzo. Just talk about this mix. Where does it factor in terms of the mix you're talking about in your findings? Go ahead and I know you.
Absolutely. We talked about weapons survivability, and hypersonic speeds can give us more survivability. As Secretary Kendall has said, there are a lot of ways of improving the survivability of our weapons, so not just speeds. So our hypersonic weapons must be affordable enough to buy in quantity. And when you take a look at boost glide weapons, I cited one, the Army's $40 to $50 million a shot. Two targets can buy an F-35 that we can reuse over and over and over again. Or they can buy a heck of a lot of those mid-range weapons I talked about. But there are another class of hypersonic weapons, and that's scramjet, air-launched weapons. And I think at moderate ranges, 500 to 600 nautical miles standoff, there's a good chance that scramjet powered hypersonic weapons can be procured, and it'd be much, much, much more affordable. I look forward to your thoughts on that.
Dr. Corley.
Well, I think, the role for hypersonic weapons really is that, first of all, deterrence and strategic messaging. But from a practical standpoint, it really, should it come to that, they're a piece of rolling back the IADs along with subsequent waves of crewed and uncrewed platforms to unlock that joint force. But nobody goes into the World Series with the strategy of we're going to win it with home runs. So I think you've got to have that balanced approach. I think we were headed there, okay, hypersonics is going to solve everything. And I think now we've got to take a more balanced approach, and I think you point that out in your paper very, very well. I think hypersonics could be used to support swarms, so they could be it can be very distracting, as they're monitoring an incoming hypersonic weapon, and then you have a swarm come, to really do the effect on target, or vice versa. You have a swarm distract them while you're engaging with a hypersonic target. So I think there's some synergies there that can be used together. So I think both hypersonic boost glide and the cruise missiles have a role, but I think from a practical standpoint, really accelerating the ability of the cruise missiles to provide that shorter range, more affordable application of hypersonics is just as important. Now, there's also the strategic targets that you need the long range for, but that would be what I would say about the mix.
Yeah, let me jump in here just real quick and remind folks that if the decision cycle takes longer than the time of flight of the missile, what are you using a hypersonic weapon for?
It really comes down to survivability at that point, right?
You can save a lot of money.
We say time. I think the argument to say that hypersonics are for time-critical targets, just as you are implying, that does not solve the equation because there's much longer portions to that equation, but it doesn't, it is a means of enhancing survivability, but I think you can do that with supersonic weapons that maybe aren't as expensive as well.
Yeah, the key really is I mentioned earlier during my briefing, understand your target set, and ours is not the same as China's. So replicating what they're doing by buying lots and lots of hypersonic weapons and IRBMs and so forth and so on doesn't make sense except to a small crowd of policy non-operational people.
And people trying to solidify their portion of the budget.
There you go.
Air launch cheaper, so let's get rid of the surface launch stuff.
And one more 3 C's. We've heard China, China, China. I'll say capacity, capacity, capacity.
Well said. Well, okay, so we're going to move to, we got like 4 minutes left, but we've got to get to this discussion. I'm sure all three of you will have some things to say about this, but I'll start with Gonzo. There's this debate in town between advocates for a penetrating strike and those advocating for these long-range missiles that we're talking about right now. So the outcome of this, though, like General Deptula said, is really going to have a huge impact on how the money's spent and what the portfolio looks like and how effective it is against a threat. So talk to us. You did a lot of work in this report about this debate.
I'm a fan of some standoff weapons. No question about it. They have advantages that direct attack needs mid-range weapons can't provide. But that said, very long-range, service-launch weapons that are extremely expensive, logistics intensive, huge footprints on the ground, problems closing the kill chain in a timely fashion, especially against targets that are mobile, and that is our problem in China. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I like the Prism. Army should buy the Prism for Europe. That's the right theater, that's the right target set, that's the right time of flight, etc.
Well, I think it goes back to what was said this morning, putting previous generation weapons on future generation aircraft just doesn't make a lot of sense. I gave a talk several years ago, looking back 10 years ago, looking back 30 years and say, 30 years from now, do we want to have the same weapons that we had 30 years ago on our airplanes? But that's what we're kind of doing. I kind of was sobering this morning when he was talking about Desert Storm being 30 years ago, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm getting old. But, I think that's the reality. We're still fighting with yesterday's weapons on tomorrow's platforms.
Hey, while you got the, go ahead, General. Oh, while you got the mic, Dr. Corley, one last question for you is, okay, so on the horizon, do we have technologies that will increase munitions lethality but not inflate the cost a lot? Do we see that on the horizon?
Well, we are always trying to drive that calculus down and put more capability. The more capability you can put into a less expensive platform like a weapon that's expendable, and dial back some of the the margin that we have that's built into today's weapons, because we want to pull them out of a box after 20 years and make sure they work the first time when you hang them on an aircraft. That's what we ask of our weapons today. And if you can make more affordable weapons that are going to be used and replaced, parts of them, those expendable parts, more readily, we can drive that cost down. Yeah. And again, not making so many different weapons, but cooperating as an industry base to develop more and more of the same things and to leverage those economies of scale.
We love what you do at the Munitions Directorate. General Deptula, you have any closing comments by chance?
No, I think I just emphasize the importance of this area, and it's one of the places I'll finish where I started. Munitions tend to get neglected during peacetime, but given the kinds of challenges that we're facing, potential peer-level fights in the future, we've got to modernize and increase our munitions accounts to be able to handle the size of the kind of challenges that we're sure to face in the future.
Oh, thank you, sir. And thank you, Dr. Corley. Go ahead, one last
I've got one last closing comment. I just want to, because you can't go to the recession without talking about digital engineering. I think that is really going to be a key to us going faster and cheaper as well in the future, and we're starting to see that in the weapons community as well.
Gonzo?
We can have the best 5th and 6th gen force in the world. We can have the largest bomber force in the world. We can have NGADs out our ears. If they don't have weapons, that does not translate into combat power. And General Deptula is exactly right. The time to buy those weapons is now.
Okay, folks, this brings us to the conclusion here. Look, if you are interested in this discussion, you can download Gonzo's paper at mitchellaerospacepower.org, but I'm asking you, sign up, and you'll get distro on all of Mitchell Institute's announcements, their events. We've got a podcast you can listen to every week for 30 or 40 minutes. That's Aerospace Advantage. But go ahead and sign up. It doesn't cost you a thing. We'd like to have you on our team. We're not going to give any gifts to the panelists. I thank you for your support today because we're donating money to get the Guardians and Airmans to the barbecue tonight, so stay sober till then, please. And the next event is at 1550, so thank you for all coming.